Welcome to the sound that never stopped echoing beneath the soil of Georgia. The slow creak of a cellar door that no one dares to open, and the whisper of a woman who they say was buried but never truly gone. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. Maybe somewhere between your world and hers, she's listening to. It began on a night when the cane fields burned brighter than the moon. The air was thick, heavy with ash and sorrow. Men with torches shouted orders above the roar of fire, and somewhere behind the plantation house in that narrow wooden cellar, someone was screaming. The kind of scream that doesn't end. It just fades into memory. They say the overseer sealed the door himself, hammered the boards shut while her voice still trembled on the other side. Her name, like so many others, was never written in any record. No ledger, no headstone, just a rumor in the fields. A curse whispered by those who dared to work the soil again. A century and a half later, when restoration crews began digging near that same cabin, their shovels hit something hollow. Not bone, not wood, but a chamber dry untouched with markings burned into the walls, symbols no one could read, and a dress folded neatly on the dirt floor. The moment the sunlight touched it, every tool in the shed went silent. Batteries died. Radios buzzed with voices that weren't there. The locals say she still guards the threshold. That if you knock 3 times, you'll hear a 4th knock back. Some call it superstition, others memory. But when the air turns cold and the cane fields sway without wind, it feels like the past isn't just remembered here. It's alive. 1856, Georgia. The air hung low as if the sky itself was pressed down upon the earth. The fields stretched endlessly rows of sugarcane, swaying like prisoners in chains, whispering as the wind passed through their narrow leaves. Each stalk carried the scent of labor, sweat, and blood baked into its skin by the southern sun. The plantation was alive, but not with joy. It breathed like a thing wounded. Too much history trapped beneath its roots. At dawn, mist clung to the soil, a pale shroud that softened everything, hiding the scars of the night before. Crows perched along the fence posts, black against the dim horizon, their calls echoing over the distant hum of insects. From the main house came the faint clang of a bell, a sound meant to summon to command. But in the cabins near the edge of the property, where the smoke rose thin and gray from dying fires, the people already knew what it meant. Another day, another reckoning beneath the same merciless sun. The cellar sat behind the last cabin, half sunk into the slope of the hill. No door now, just a mouth in the ground, sealed by wood gone soft with time. No one approached it in daylight. The older ones said you could still hear her name there if you listened too long. But no one dared to try. They said she had been a midwife, a quiet woman who carried secrets like sacred songs. The kind who spoke to the earth when others prayed to heaven. Inside the main house, the world was different. White columns, heavy curtains, perfume and laughter that never reached beyond the porch. The overseer's whip hung on a nail by the door, still glistening from oil and rain. And yet beyond that narrow threshold, the real Georgia existed, where feet moved through mud, where hands bled against wood, where a single look could mean punishment or salvation. Night came fast in those fields. One moment the sun was gold and heavy, the next it was gone, swallowed by the tree line. Fires flickered near the cabins as voices rose in rhythm, low, ancient songs carried by the enslaved. They weren't just melodies. They were maps, prayers, and warnings, disguised as hymns. Wade in the water. Someone would hum, and the rest would follow each note, a code, each pause a space for the unseen to listen. It was in that same rhythm that her story survived. Passed from one tongue to another like a flame cupped in trembling hands. They said she had defied the master, once refused to kneel when ordered, refused to turn her eyes downward. And in that refusal, in that single act of stillness, something cracked in the order of things. The punishment was swift, But what followed was never written down, only told in whispers. When storms came, lightning often struck near the old cellar. Never the house, never the barns. Always there the same patch of ground blackened over and over again, as if the heavens themselves were trying to mark the spot. In 1856, the South was already trembling. The Fugitive Slave Act had turned free soil into a hunting ground. The newspapers in Savannah and Macon spoke of runaways like lost property, printed their descriptions beside ads for shoes and sugar. But in the hush of the cane fields, people spoke of another kind of escape, one that had nothing to do with the North or with freedom papers. They spoke of the cellar and the woman who had vanished into it. The overseers laughed. The owners ignored it. But the workers knew. On nights when the fog rolled thick, dogs refused to go near the cellar's edge. Horses balked, eyes wide, hooves trembling. And sometimes when the wind shifted, a voice rose soft, humming, almost human. The plantation ledger for that year listed losses: a mule, 2 barrels of molasses, 1 female property found unknown. Nothing more. No record of burial. No entry of death. Just unknown. The cabins bore the weight of silence after that. Children were told never to wander past the last fence. Women left offerings: a piece of cloth, a flower, a few drops of water poured onto the dirt. They called her by no name, only she. To name her was to invite her. To remember her, though, was to stay safe. Beyond the fields, the town of Augusta slept, unaware or unwilling. Its church bells tolled on Sundays, its streets filled with the sound of carriages and sermons about obedience. But on the outskirts, in the shanties where smoke from the mills mixed with swamp fog, there were those who swore they'd seen her shadow, tall, thin, moving across the dirt road, though no moon hung in the sky. Time in the South moved slow, thick like syrup, heavy like the air. But even in stillness, history pressed forward. The soil of Georgia was restless. Every plow turned not just clay, but memory, and every seed planted was a question buried underfoot. When the Civil War would come, this land would drink deeply again. But in 1856, it already felt haunted. Haunted by what had been done and by what could never be undone. And if you stood near the cellar at dusk, when the light bent low through the trees, you could see the earth breathing. The boards shifting just slightly, as if something beneath them or someone was still listening. The air would cool suddenly then. The birds would stop, and for a heartbeat the entire field, the whole world would fall silent. Then faintly a whisper, still here. The first records came from a thin stack of ledgers, brittle pages stored in a county courthouse that smelled of mold and old heat. The ink had bled, the handwriting slanted desperate, as if the man writing knew that time would one day erase his cruelty. The page was dated June 1856. Beneath lists of livestock sugar yields and debts owed to the Savannah merchants, one entry lingered. Female age approximately 30, property loss, cause unknown. No name, no burial, no further remark. Just loss. That word, small sterile, carried a weight far heavier than the paper it sat on. For in that plantation, loss meant something that once served. Something that had ceased to obey. It was an erasure disguised as record-keeping. Weeks later, another document surfaced, a letter sent to the county sheriff. Its tone was annoyed, not alarmed. She went missing one night after sundown. Took nothing left, no trace. There are whispers among the hands, nonsense about curses and spirits. I'll need this contained before harvest. Contained. That was the language of control, not of justice, but of keeping the living quiet. In the margins, a note in another hand. Lighter ink, smaller letters. They say the cellar hums when the moon is low. That sentence was never meant to survive. And yet somehow it did. When the WPA field researchers arrived in Georgia nearly 80 years later, recording oral histories from the last generation born in bondage, they heard that same hum described again. One old woman, her voice thin but steady, told them, "My grandmama used to say if you hear a song without a singer, don't follow it. That's her, the one they sealed up down there." She ain't mad no more, but she don't rest neither. The interviewer had paused, pen trembling slightly before asking her name. We didn't speak it. You don't call a spirit back once it finally learned to whisper. Every story that followed changed in detail, but never in core. Some said she'd been a healer, knew the roots that soothed fever and the songs that made childbirth easier. Others swore she'd carried a forbidden Bible reading verses in secret, saying that one day the chains would melt like wax. And one story, half whispered, half sung, said that she had cursed the overseer the night he came for her, not with words, but with silence. That she'd looked him in the eye and said nothing. And when dawn came, he was found trembling in his bed, his skin cold as river water. Fact and folklore, one feeding the other. In the archives of the Savannah Republican, a small paragraph dated July 2, 1856, mentions an unfortunate incident on the Bennett estate, minor disturbances among the workers, one woman unaccounted for. The next issue made no mention of her again. But in that gap, in that deliberate silence, something endured. Local folklore filled it. They said her spirit guarded the boundary between the living and the forgotten. Some nights when storms rolled across the plains, lanterns would flicker in the empty fields. No wind, no footsteps, just that faint amber glow swaying between the stalks. The elders called them walking lights. The children called them her hands. One of the former field hands, interviewed in 1937, described the cellar as a door that breathes. You go near it, he said, and the air gets heavy like it's pushing you back. And if you lean close, you hear crying, but not sad crying. It sounded like she talking to somebody far away. Maybe to God. Maybe to somebody under there with her. The interviewer asked if anyone had tried to open it. Once. A white man came with a spade. Said he'd prove us all fools. When he struck the wood, something hollered out from the ground, not loud but deep. He dropped the spade, ran off, and by morning his hair was gray. The tape of that interview crackled. The woman recounting it kept crossing herself, whispering under her breath between sentences. You could hear her breath catch each time she said, cellar. For historians, stories like these fall between worlds. Too detailed to dismiss, too impossible to verify. But the soil remembers what paper forgets. And in that corner of Georgia, even the earth carries sound. Archaeologists who visited the site in the 1970s found remnants of ash layered deep beneath the foundation, not from fire but from ritual. Traces of salt iron nails arranged in a circle, and fragments of blue glass. Items consistent with conjure practices used across the South Protection Charms banishment wards. They concluded that someone had sealed the space with intention. But who? That answer never came. The folklore said she sealed herself, that the cellar wasn't her prison, but her altar. That she'd chosen to stay between worlds, guarding those who couldn't yet leave. They said she appears in reflections not as a full body, but as the edge of a figure, the curve of a shoulder, a silhouette caught in candlelight. One man, a descendant of the original plantation owner, wrote to a local paper in 1902, every woman in my family who looks into that mirror before dawn sees her face beside their own. For that reason, the mirror is covered now. No one questioned him publicly. But the story spread quietly, moving from household to household, like smoke through the pines. By the time the 20th century began, the cellar was gone, collapsed into itself, swallowed by kudzu and time. Yet travelers still avoided that road. Mail carriers left packages at the gate and turned back before dusk. The county maps marked the site simply as Old Bennett grounds, nothing more. But there was one final document, an 1859 property inventory drawn up after the owner's death. Under assets unrecovered, the same word appeared once again. Loss. No object, no explanation, just that single cold syllable that has followed her for nearly 2 centuries. Somewhere between the paper and the earth, between the fact and the whisper, her story remains half buried, half alive. And when the evening light cuts through the trees of Georgia just right, it paints the fields in gray and gold. The same colors you see in old photographs, when ghosts still had the patience to stand still long enough to be seen. There was a night, years before the cellar was sealed, when she sang. Not to anyone. Not for anyone. Just to the air itself. They said her voice was low, like the hum of bees behind the chapel. It carried over the cane fields past the quarters, all the way to the creek where the moonlight pooled in silver ripples. The other women would pause in their washing heads, tilted listening. Even the wind seemed to soften when she sang. The men called her Sister Mariam, though no one knew if that was her real name. Names back then were fragile things. They could be taken away, like breath. At dusk, she would sit by the small fire outside her cabin. Her hands, scarred but steady, worked strips of cloth into little knots. Charms, she said, to keep nightmares from crawling into your sleep. She never sold them. She just gave them away. Sometimes she'd tuck one into a child's pocket when they weren't looking. Sometimes she'd leave one at the base of a tree, whispering into the bark. There was a boy who followed her everywhere, 8 years old, bare feet calloused from the fields. His name was Eli. His mother had died in childbirth, and Mariam had been the one who held her hand through the final breath. After that, the boy clung to her shadow. He said she smelled like smoke and river water and safety. One evening, he asked her why she always talked to the ground. She smiled, that slow, quiet kind of smile that carried both love and warning. Because the earth remembers child, even when people forget. No. In the months before she vanished, something changed in the air around the plantation. The owners had grown fearful rumors of uprisings spreading from Virginia to Louisiana. Newspapers whispered of trouble among the Negro quarters, of strange lights and restless minds. Punishments became harsher. Whips cracked for reasons no one understood, but Mariam. She grew calmer. The worse it got, the steadier she became. She began waking before dawn, standing at the field's edge, facing east, eyes closed, palms open. Some said she was praying. Others said she was listening. The night before she disappeared, the air turned wrong. The wind had a pulse to it, heavy, rhythmic, like something breathing. Eli woke to shouting, not from the cabins, but from the main house. He ran toward the noise and saw torchlight moving like a swarm of fireflies near the cellar. Through the haze of smoke and yelling, he saw her silhouette. She wasn't running. She wasn't fighting. She was just standing there still as a statue, eyes fixed on the man holding the torch. The overseer. Eli said later that the ground trembled, or maybe it was just his heart pounding. He remembered her lips moving. No sound. Just a movement. A whisper that felt bigger than words. Then the torchlight went out. One moment she was there, the next, nothing but darkness and the sound of hammering wood. They locked her in. Eli didn't sleep for 3 days. On the 4th night, he crept back. The boards were still there, nailed in haste, crooked. He pressed his ear against the cracks. Nothing. Then faintly a hum. The same song she used to sing by the fire. Only slower now. Deeper, as if it came from beneath the ground. He whispered her name once, Mariam, and something whispered back. Eh? The next morning, the boy was gone too. Some said he ran north. Some said he fell into the river. But years later, an old man living miles away in Alabama told a WPA interviewer a strange thing. He said that when he was a child, a man named Eli had come through their camp one night, carrying a small wooden charm in his hand tied with cloth and hair. He said it'd keep her near the man remembered. Said she ain't trapped, she watching. Said if the cellar opened, she come back and finish what she started. The interviewer had asked what that meant. The old man smiled, toothless and tired. It means she's still working. The field's still hers. In 1936, a photographer from Washington came through Georgia documenting Negro folklore and superstition for the Federal Writers Project. His name was Joseph Harlan. The locals called him the man with the glass eye because one of his lenses always caught the light wrong. He stayed 3 nights near the old Bennett plantation. On his 2nd night, he took a photograph of the ruins, the last cabin still standing, the outline of the collapsed cellar behind it. When he developed the film weeks later, there was something he hadn't seen with his own eyes, a faint figure in the corner of the frame. A woman's outline, barefoot, standing at the edge of the frame, like she'd stepped in just as the shutter clicked. The negative was sent to the Library of Congress and then lost. Only a copy remains printed in an obscure folklore journal decades later. Beneath it a caption reads, "Unidentified woman, Georgia 1936, image artifact unknown." In 1972, a local teacher named Alma Jenkins, a descendant of enslaved families in Burke County, led her students on a history project to document haunted sites of Reconstruction. When they reached the old Bennett grounds, the air turned strange again. The tape recorder they'd brought hissed with static even when unplugged. On playback beneath the teacher's voice, another sound bled through a faint humming. Low, steady, familiar. Alma wrote in her notes, "It's the same tune my grandmother used to hum while braiding my hair. I never knew where it came from. Now, I think I do." She didn't publish the findings, said she didn't want to turn history into horror, but she never returned to the site again. Bitaught, what made her so unforgettable was not the curse, not the fear. It was the quiet power that lingered in the memory of everyone she touched. She wasn't a ghost because she refused death. She was a ghost because others refused to forget her. Generations after, the people who still lived on that land would tell their children before storms, "If the wind starts to sing, close your eyes and listen. It's her warning, not her haunting." Old men on porches would nod to the fields and say, "That's her weather." And when lightning struck, always near the same patch of ground, they didn't run. They watched. They believed she was still speaking in her own language of fire and soil. Some even said she came to them in dreams, standing at the foot of their beds, head bowed, hands open. Never angry, never cruel, just watching as if counting the breaths of those who carried her story forward. In one WPA transcript, a woman's voice, shaking but proud, said this: "They buried her wrong, so she learned to rise right. That's why she walk. That's why she sing. The curse ain't on us, it's on the ones who forgot." And maybe that's the truth. Maybe what people called a haunting was only remembrance that refused to fade. The living tried to bury her with silence, but silence in the end became her weapon. Because when a name is erased, the earth itself starts whispering to fill the space. So the next time someone passes through those forgotten fields of Georgia and feels the ground tremble beneath their feet, maybe it isn't fear. Maybe it's recognition. Maybe it's her heartbeat, still echoing through the roots, reminding the land who it once belonged to. And somewhere in the rhythm of crickets and the sigh of the wind, you can almost hear it again, that hum low and steady. A voice older than chains, softer than time. Still here, the record was not supposed to exist. And yet there it was, tucked inside a forgotten archive in Atlanta, sealed in a brittle envelope marked Property Survey, 1858. When the historian unfolded it, the smell of smoke and iron rose from the pages, a scent of old blood, perhaps, or memory. The document listed coordinates for abandoned acreage, once belonging to the Bennett estate, and beside the boundary lines, a note written in a darker ink: "Unfit for cultivation. Soil disturbance noted. Avoid excavation." Avoid. That word repeated again and again across other property transfers for the next 20 years. It was as though the land itself had become taboo, a forbidden patch of Georgia that everyone wanted to sell, but no one wanted to touch. The first man to try was a former Confederate officer turned prospector, Thomas R. Clay, according to county records. In 1871, he petitioned to drain the creek and reclaim the overgrown plantation. But within 3 months, he disappeared. His belongings were found still inside the cabin boots by the door coffee cup, half-filled papers stacked neatly on the table. The sheriff's report, preserved in faded blue pencil, says only, no sign of struggle, no blood. But the ground outside his cabin appeared freshly turned, as though something beneath had shifted. The property remained abandoned again. A century later, in 1957, A team of state surveyors arrived mapping rural land parcels for a new road project. One of them, a man named Harold Kinney, kept a personal log. The journal still exists, its cover warped by humidity pages filled with typewriter ink and nervous handwriting. June 5. Reached Old Bennett site. Soil unstable. Instruments flickering, compass and magnetometer both useless. Felt vibration underfoot, brief, rhythmic, not seismic. Sounded like humming. Kinney's superior later crossed out the line with thick pen strokes, but the imprint of the word remained pressed into the paper. Humming. The next day's entry ends abruptly. June 6th. Radio picked up faint voice when we tested signal strength. Not language I recognize. Female. Soft. Recorder malfunctioned, left site early. 3 months after that trip, Kinney left the department, moved north, and never worked in the field again. In a letter to his brother written years later, he admitted something he'd never told anyone else. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear her still humming under the floorboards of my dreams. Official records treat these as coincidence. Electrical interference, soil resonance, old myths refusing to die. But beneath the skepticism lies a pattern too consistent to ignore, a thread woven through nearly 200 years of documentation, folklore, and human testimony. Historians began calling it the Cellar line, the invisible lineage of stories that always trace back to the same patch of ground. From slave ledgers to WPA recordings, from surveyor notes to modern paranormal logs, all roads lead to Bennett's forgotten cellar. And yet, despite the testimonies, despite the artifacts, there is still no evidence of a body. In 1994, a small historical society in Augusta attempted a controlled dig. They received funding from a local university eager to verify or debunk the myth. Photographs from the dig show sunburned students standing beside shallow trenches, the red clay cracked beneath their boots. On the third day, they unearthed a row of nails arranged in a perfect circle iron, corroded tips blackened. Beneath it, a single piece of blue glass fractured like an eye. The project halted immediately. The director of the excavation, Dr. Marjorie Fields, later described a sensation of pressure in her ears moments before the discovery. Her field notes read, "Temperature dropped suddenly, wind ceased. Tools refused to work. Felt as if the ground itself was holding its breath." Within a week, the dig was closed. The glass fragment was sent to a lab for analysis and vanished in transit. No report was ever filed. But what makes the story heavier is what came next, not the supernatural, but the undeniable. In 2003, digitization of Freedmen's Bureau records revealed something unexpected, a testimony filed in 1867 by a freedwoman named Eliza Bennett. In her statement, she described returning to the plantation after the war to retrieve belongings left behind. She wrote, "We walked past the hill where she once lived. The air was still. We could not stay. It felt wrong, like walking on somebody's breath. I told my husband, she ain't gone, not yet." It was the first written acknowledgement that she, unnamed, but clearly known, had been more than legend. Eliza's affidavit included another line that had been redacted in later transcriptions. Under infrared light, archivists recovered it. They sealed her in so we could be free. That single sentence, a paradox, rewired everything. What if the cellar wasn't a curse, but a covenant? What if her entrapment wasn't punishment, but protection? Across the South, traces of this pattern appear: conjure rituals meant to bind spirits of the dead who had suffered unjustly to keep them from becoming vengeful. Circles of iron nails, blue bottles to trap restless souls, salt lines to mark safe ground. And perhaps, just perhaps, those who sealed the cellar weren't trying to bury her. They were helping her hold the line. Because after that night in 1856, no more uprisings, no more fires, no more lost children were recorded on the Bennett estate. The violence stopped. The crops failed, yes, but the killing ceased. The price of peace was her confinement. In modern times, ghost hunters with EMF meters and night vision cameras have wandered the same patch of soil. Their recordings pick up anomalies, low frequencies, temperature drops, faint whispers. They treat it as spectacle proof of haunting. But to the descendants of the enslaved families, it's not a ghost hunt. It's visitation. One descendant, a woman named Ruth Harris, returns every Juneteenth. She brings flowers, wild magnolias, and leaves them at the overgrown mound where the cellar once stood. She doesn't film. She doesn't speak. She just stands there, hands clasped. When asked why, she said softly, "She kept us safe when no one else did." The least we can do is remember. Her grandmother had told her never to call the woman by name, to simply whisper "thank you" when lightning strikes near the old grounds. The deeper researchers dig into the archives, the clearer the fracture becomes history recorded by those who owned ink and paper versus memory carried by those who owned nothing but voice. Fact versus folklore, but sometimes they're the same. The 1867 Bureau testimony, the 1871 Sheriff's Report, the 1957 Field Log, all describe vibrations, hums, heat changes, soil disturbances. And all were written by different people across different eras, none of whom had access to each other's words. Coincidence or continuity? The documentary footage filmed in 2011 shows modern scholars standing on that same hill, their microphones barely catching the wind. One of them, Dr. Field's former student, whispers as she looks toward the trees, "The strangest thing is, I can't tell if the humming's coming from the ground or from me." And maybe that's what the curse really was. Not a malice, not a haunting, but a resonance. A frequency carried through bloodlines, through stories, through the soil that once bore witness. Because sometimes history refuses silence. Sometimes it hums. As night falls over Georgia, the field still looks the same. The same wind, the same light, the same shadows leaning long across the red earth. But if you listen closely under the song of the crickets and the faraway thunder, you'll hear it again, low, steady, unbroken. The sound of one woman's defiance echoing through time, a heartbeat preserved not in marble or metal, but in soil. And every record, every report, every cautious notation, and every dusty ledger still circles back to that single truth. She never left. There are moments in history when the paper finally meets the dirt, when every whisper, every name half erased, finds a way to speak again, not through books, not through mouths, but through vibration. And that's where her story begins to rise. In 2019, a team of graduate researchers from Emory University received a grant to study acoustic anomalies in Southern historical sites. They weren't ghost hunters, at least not the kind that carried cameras and crucifixes. They were scientists, historians with microphones mapping frequencies, trying to prove that folklore could leave sonic fingerprints. Their project Echoes of the South focused on old churches, battlefields, and plantation grounds. But the coordinates that changed everything were the ones marked Bennett Site Restricted Access. On a humid June afternoon, they arrived, 4 of them, carrying ground sensors and audio rigs. The field looked ordinary grass, high as their knees cicadas screaming from the trees. Yet the moment they powered up their instruments, the static began. The same low hum, recorded decades before, pressed itself against the microphones, soft, rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat under mud. At first they thought it was feedback. Then one of them, a woman named Naomi Green, recognized the pattern. She'd grown up hearing the same melody hummed by her grandmother while she cooked on Sundays. "It's a hymn," she said quietly. But no church ever claimed it. The recording they captured that day lasts exactly 37 seconds. You can hear the insects, the wind, the faint creak of trees. And beneath it, a human voice, slow, almost sighing, rising, falling, repeating 3 notes over and over. 3 notes, just enough to make a prayer. They didn't release the audio publicly, fearing mockery. But the sound haunted them. Naomi began to dream of a woman standing at the edge of a field, her face hidden by dusk. In every dream, the woman was humming. Always the same 3 notes. And then in August, Naomi's grandmother passed away. Among her belongings, in an old cedar chest, she found a small charm made of knotted cloth and river stone. the same pattern described in the WPA files of 1936. Tied to it was a note, "Keep this near when the ground hums." Naomi didn't sleep that night. She played the recording again and again until the sound filled the room like breath. Her husband said he felt the bed vibrate though the speakers were silent. That's when she realized the sound wasn't coming from the device anymore. It was coming from beneath the floor. Across centuries, the facts and the folklore finally began to fold into one another, like two hands meeting in the dark. The sealed cellar, the humming soil, the broken blue glass, the missing name, all threads of a single, unfinished ritual. And somewhere inside that pattern was her intention. The deeper the historians looked, the more impossible the timeline became. In letters written by Union soldiers who camped near Augusta in 1865, there were mentions of lights over the fields and strange singing from under the ground. One captain wrote, "The colored women in camp told us it was a guardian, said she was keeping the earth from splitting open." That same phrase, "keeping the earth from splitting open," appears again a century later in a 1964 sermon recorded at a black church 2 counties away. The preacher voice trembling over the microphone shouted, "Some of us think we free because the chain broke." But somebody had to hold that ground still while it did. The congregation answered with a long, low amen. It wasn't history repeating itself. It was memory echoing, vibrating through generations, a living folklore built on the foundation of one woman's endurance. In the fall of 2020, Naomi returned to the Bennett site, this time with descendants from several local families. They brought candles, hymns, and field recorders. She called it the listening ceremony. They stood in a circle where the cellar once lay buried. Some knelt, others hummed, some just closed their eyes. When the first candle was lit, the wind stopped. The leaves held still. The microphones captured nothing for the first minute, just silence. But then faintly, the hum returned. Louder this time, full, harmonized. There were no speakers, no phones, no explanation. Yet the sound grew richer, layered with depth. One voice became 2, then 3, until the air shimmered with the vibration of a chorus unseen. Naomi fell to her knees. Tears streaked down her face as she whispered, "She's not gone." No one moved. No one spoke. The ground itself seemed to breathe. The sound rose, then broke, and the wind exhaled all at once, scattering the candles, snuffing the flames. When light returned, the grass around them was pressed flat, as though hundreds of feet had walked there in a slow circle. That night, the recording was played back in a studio in Atlanta. The waveform analysis showed something impossible. The harmonic frequency matched a human heartbeat. Not random vibration, not static. Pulsing at 68 beats per minute. The same rhythm measured in the hums from 1957, 1936. And even the analog crackle of 1867's recovered phonograph cylinder, the one found mislabeled in the Savannah Historical Society's vault. Different centuries, same pulse. How do you archive a ghost? How do you record an emotion that refuses to die? Maybe you don't. Maybe you just listen. The climax came not in sound, but in silence. Weeks later, Naomi stood alone on that hill just before dawn. She carried the charm, worn now and faded. The air was cool, that rare Georgia morning calm, before summer burned everything again. She placed the charm on the ground where the cellar had once been. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "You can rest now." For the first time in her life, the field stayed quiet. No hum, no tremor, no wind. Only birds, the first call of the morning. Naomi turned to leave. And just before she reached the edge of the field, she heard it not behind her, but beside her, as if walking in step. A woman's breath, warm and near. Not angry, not lost, just present. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. Somewhere between science and story, the curse had become a covenant again, the boundary no longer sealed by fear, but guarded by memory. Weeks later, the recording from that night was sent to the university archive. The file name written by Naomi herself, it remains the only entry in the archive labeled both folklore and verified historical audio source. To those who visit the site now, it looks like any other field, the same red clay, the same scattered magnolia roots. But the air is never still for long. Every so often a tremor rolls beneath your feet, too soft to be an earthquake, too steady to be coincidence. And if you stand there long enough, you'll notice something else. The wind doesn't move the grass at random. It bends in slow, perfect circles, as if tracing an old ritual no one taught it to remember. That's when you'll feel it, a hum deep in your chest, rising not from the ground, but from within you. It isn't fear, it isn't grief, it's recognition. The same pulse that carried through 1856, through the bureau records, through the hymn Naomi's grandmother sang without knowing why. The same rhythm that kept the land from splitting open. And in that moment, for one fleeting breath, you understand why she never left. She wasn't haunting the living. She was holding the world together until they were ready to listen. Time moves differently in places that carry memory. Differently when the earth itself remembers what men have tried to forget. The Bennett plantation no longer exists in any official sense. The grand house collapsed decades ago, swallowed by kudzu and rot, the cabins long since claimed by the forest. Yet the air holds a weight, the scent of burned cane, of damp earth, of the faint trace of smoke that never fully disappears. It lingers, and those who walk there cannot ignore it. Descendants of the enslaved still return generations later, carrying songs, whispers, and offerings. Magnolia's small trinkets, iron charms, tied with thread tokens meant to honor her presence. They call her She Who Waits, or simply Mariam, in hushed tones, though her true name may never have been recorded. To name her fully is to invite her closer, and everyone knows she is listening. The creek near the old cellar bends like a silver snake across the land. And when storms roll over Georgia, locals swear the wind carries her voice. Not a scream, not a threat, but a hum, the same low rhythmic pulse that has persisted across centuries. One historian recording oral testimonies in 2009 wrote, "Even those who have never set foot on the property know her story. Their dreams are shaped by it. Their memories carry it. It is not merely a tale, but a living current that runs through the community." Schools in neighboring counties occasionally teach the story not as a ghost tale, not as legend, but as history in layers. The factual record, her disappearance, the sealed cellar, the Bureau reports. The folkloric layer, the hum, the whispers, the protective charms. Students are encouraged to examine both to understand that truth is sometimes not what is written on paper, but what pulses beneath it. The land itself bears witness. Archaeologists who return for excavation notice the soil resists disturbance. Equipment fails inexplicably. Animals avoid certain areas. Birds circle and cry, leaving the observer with the sense that this is not just haunted ground. It is consecrated by memory, by suffering, and by the quiet defiance of one woman who refused to be erased. Some visitors have described moments of clarity there. A scholar felt a sudden chill, and despite the summer heat, heard the faint syllables of a song she had learned from her grandmother. Another reported that standing near the creek, she could feel what she described as a heartbeat in the soil, steady measured alive. Mariam's story echoes beyond Georgia. It resonates in the spirituals still sung in black churches, in the hymns passed down orally, in the WPA narratives preserved for posterity. Her pulse, the rhythm she established with her presence, lives on in memory and ritual. She was both a guardian and a witness to injustice, to survival, to the quiet courage of those who lived and labored under the lash. And yet, her tale remains unfinished. Scholars, folklorists, and descendants alike feel it stretch forward an open loop of history that asks to be acknowledged. The hum beneath the soil is not a threat. It is a reminder that even when erased from records, even when ignored by the dominant narrative, the resilience of those who endured binds past and present together. The soil, the wind, the whispering fields, they tell us something vital. That history is alive, that the past is never truly gone, that memory can protect and bear witness when others cannot. So when night falls, and the shadows stretch across the Georgia fields, when the wind carries an impossible hum, when the cane bends without reason, pause. Listen and remember. You have just walked through a record of a life unforgotten. A story sealed beneath boards, whispered through generations, and kept alive by those who dared to remember. The cellar may be gone. The boards may have rotted. But she is still here. Her legacy is not in haunting. It is in remembrance, in vigilance, in the echoes that refuse to fade. And perhaps if you stand long enough, and if you allow the air to carry its weight to your ears, you too will hear the pulse steady and unwavering, the heartbeat of a woman who never left. Mom, she is waiting, not to curse, not to frighten, but to remind us that history, when ignored, still demands to be acknowledged, that voices silenced too long will find a way to speak, and that we, the living, must listen. Before you leave this story behind, take a moment. Reflect. Where does memory live? How do we honor those who endured in silence? And how many more echoes are walking quietly beneath our very feet, waiting for us to hear them? The story does not end here. It continues. In every field, in every song, in every breath that carries history forward. And she is still here.